Hi everyone. In this video on the skeletal system, we are going to start by the injuries that might occur to the bones and in particular to the shafts of the long bones. Here you can see that there is a broken bone, and this part where the bone has been broken is called the fracture. So this is a fractured bone or a bone that has been broken down at a certain area. We have two types of fractures that can occur in the bone. We have simple fractures when the injury involves only the bone and the two injured bony parts stay in place and are not displaced and do not have sharp ends that injure the surrounding tissues. But sometimes when the fracture is a huge fracture, like this one, and it occurs in a large bone like the tibia, and there is a sharp end, and the muscles contract on the bone so that they move the bone or displace it from its place, the sharp pointed end of the bone might injure the soft tissues and even perforate them and appear on the outer surface of the skin, of course, resulting in severe injury of the skin and the soft tissues around the bone and bleeding, and this is called a compound fracture. Of course, the compound fracture, in case of a compound fracture, the management will be much more complicated than in the case of a simple fracture. So this first diagram showed us the difference between the two. And here we can see the same, but this is an X-ray picture. This is not a diagram. Here you can see a fracture. This is a lateral view of the leg. This is the femur bone. This is the patella. And this is the intact space in between the patella and the femur. Here is the knee joint, and this translucent part is the cartilage, and you can see a very obvious fracture that occurred. This is the lateral aspect of the tibia, and the upper fragment of the tibia has been displaced a little bit. The soft tissue does not appear here like it appears there. For example, here you can see the muscles or the soft tissues around the bone. And most probably, this is a compound fracture because if it appeared on the surface of the skin, we cannot actually decide because the soft tissue anterior to the tibia is not seen. But here, of course, it's obvious that this fracture of the humerus is a compound fracture because, as you can see, the sharp pointed fractured end of the humerus perforated the skin and appeared on the outer surface of the skin. So despite the strength of the bones can break down, can crack in certain conditions. So usually the bones have a high endurance and they can withstand a good deal of pressure and strain. But sometimes there are extreme loads or sudden impacts. Extreme loads means what? Means that for example, somebody kicks the front part of your leg, and the kick in a football match is very strong. So it's an extreme load on the bone. So the load is not only a vertical load due to a huge weight you're carrying, for example, but it might also be an oblique or lateral load, like a strong kick to your leg. But of course, extreme loads can also be very heavy stuff that is being carried by somebody who is old, whose bones are weak. Sudden impact. Sometimes the load is not high, but it comes suddenly. So your body cannot correct its position and assume the correct position that makes the bone withstand this. So the sudden impact, the risk of a sudden impact is the fact that it's a sudden impact and the body posture is not prepared to receive that sudden impact, or stress from an unusual direction. For example, when, as I said before, when the stress comes from an oblique direction, not a vertical, for example, downward direction. So the bones of the lower limb, like the femur and in the thigh and the tibia in the leg, can withstand, for example, say X Newton per unit area pressure, if this pressure is vertical downward, but cannot withstand 1/10 of this pressure if it comes from an oblique or an unusual direction. The crack or the break is called a fracture. Now, just like any other injury in the body tries to correct itself. So even if there is no medical interference, the fractured ends of the bones in some cases can heal. But in order for them to heal, of course, on their own, the fracture should be a simple fracture, not a compound fracture. The bony ends should be very close to each other, in close proximity to each other. And the fracture should be like a straight line fracture. There are no broken fragments in between the bones, because if in between the fractured ends of the bones you have some small bony fragments, they will interfere with the healing. Another very important condition for healing of the bone to occur is that the periosteum is still alive. The periosteum hasn't been damaged, because the periosteum contains, as we said before, the blood vessels, and the blood vessels are the source of the stem cells. And the stem cells, as you know from your previous study, is nothing or are nothing but undifferentiated cells that rapidly divide. And when placed in a particular differentiated tissue, they can differentiate into the same type of cells. So if they are put in liver tissue, they will differentiate into liver cells. If they are put in bone tissue, they will differentiate into bone cells. So those stem cells will be differentiated into chondroblasts, or the cells. The blast means immature cartilage cell, chondro means cartilage, and osteoblast, immature bony cells, in order to help healing, and we will see how. So even if the damage of the bone is severe, many of the lesions can heal on their own. How does this occur? At the beginning, at the site of the fracture, an accumulation of semi-solid blood occurs in order to fill in the space and to stop bleeding from the injured blood vessels and from the red bone marrow. And this is what we call a hematoma. So a hematoma is a swelling that is essentially made of blood tissue. And then after this, the macrophages, or the large non-specific white blood cells that can engulf any particle, will engulf the components of the hematoma and the bony debris, and the blood vessels of the periosteum will start forming an internal callus. The callus is a swelling that usually extends, as you can see, beyond the periphery of the bone, and it is internal because it's mainly formed inside, and it is made of fibrous tissue and cartilage tissue. How did we get the fibrous tissue and the cartilage tissue? From the stem cells that have been brought to the place by the periosteal blood vessels. These cells can differentiate into fibroblasts, or cells that can lay down collagen and elastin fibrous proteins, elongated proteins, and they can differentiate into chondroblasts, which are immature cartilage cells. The term immature is a bit misleading because it gives you the impression that the cartilage cells are not yet capable of doing any function. Yet the chondroblast can actively lay down cartilage tissue, just like the osteoblast can actively lay down bone tissue. On the contrary, when they become chondrocytes or osteocytes, mature cartilage cells or mature bone cells, they get imprisoned in their matrix and they stop laying down calcium, and they start having other functions like sensing the directions of pressures and so on. So when I was explaining the lacunae in the previous video, and I was saying that there were osteocytes inside that lay down calcium, actually, I meant that this is a bit inaccurate, or you might misunderstand this. I was talking about the osteoblasts in their late stages when they have laid down a lot of calcium and phosphorus and got imprisoned inside this matrix, and they become osteocytes. The osteocytes lays down calcium and phosphorus as well, but at a much slower rate because it starts doing or carrying out other functions. Here we have an internal callus that lies between the bony ends, but we also have the part that extends beyond the periphery of the bone, is called the external callus. So the intrusion of blood vessels and the stem cells they accompany and they contain, and the conversion of the stem cells into chondroblasts and fibroblasts has created this swelling that is called the callus, and the callus is divided into internal callus within the periphery or within the cavity of the bone, and external callus that appears on the surface. Gradually, around the blood vessels, there will be a cartilaginous tissue that will be later on converted into spongy tissue. And since both the cartilaginous tissue and the spongy tissue that is formed afterward originate in the blood vessels, so the layers of cartilage and bone will be formed around the blood vessels. And since the blood vessels are interlacing together and form like a network, so the bone itself that is newly formed will be in the form of trabeculae, and those trabeculae include blood cells in between, so it is a spongy bone trabeculae. These are the new blood vessels that have originated from the periosteal blood vessels. And then gradually the bone cells, the immature bone cells or osteoblasts, arrange themselves in the form of layers, irregular layers, which are the trabeculae, and we have a bony callus that is mainly formed of spongy bone, but gradually it will remodel to form Haversian systems and become compact bone, especially at the periphery, whereas the spongy bone remains in the central part. Here are the steps of healing of a simple fracture. At first, as we said, there is a hematoma because of bleeding, and then come the phagocytes, which are large white blood cells that look like amoeba, that have processes and that can surround particles and engulf them and digest them. So it will remove any microbes or pathogens that might cause diseases, and any tissue debris or bony debris fragments that resulted from the fracture. And then the blood vessels will bring in stem cells that will be converted into into osteoclasts. What are osteoclasts? We haven't talked about osteoclasts before. The suffix class means eating. So these are cells, bone cells, that are capable of eating up bone. So their function is complementary to the function of the phagocytes, but the phagocytes are more general. in their function, but the osteoclasts are specific in the fact that they eat up only bony debris. And then the stem cells that are brought in by the branches of the periosteal blood vessels can differentiate into fibroblasts that form the fibrous protein matrix on which the bony material or the cartilaginous proteins will be deposited, and the chondroblast or the young immature bone cells start depositing proteins that make the fibrous matrix rubbery and flexible and smooth. So the chondroblasts do the main job. They do the actual building of the cartilaginous tissue. And as I said before, it's not because they are immature cells that they cannot carry out a function. On the contrary, the chondroblasts carry a very important function, which is the actual building of the cartilaginous matrix around them. And then gradually we have a soft callus. Why is it a soft callus? Because it is made of rubbery proteins and it is not yet calcified. Some of the stem cells will differentiate into osteoblasts, and this is a turning point in the life of the bone, because the osteoblasts, again, although they are immature bone cells, but they carry out a very important and specific function, which is the actual building of the bony tissue. After having built this bony tissue, as you know, there is an external callus that needs to be removed, and we also need remodeling inside the bone to convert the irregular trabeculae of bones into regular Haversian systems. So the osteoclasts will again play a role. So they played a role at the beginning in removing bony debris, and they play a role at the end in removing the excess bony tissue. However, some bumping may remain because part of the external callus couldn't be removed completely by the osteoclast. And now we come to important definitions, but we have just mentioned them in our explanation. What are the osteoblasts? As we said before, they are immature bone cells that are capable of laying down or depositing calcium and phosphorus into the matrix, and these minerals are extracted from the blood. The osteoblasts themselves have originated in the blood because one day they were stem cells circulating in the blood. On the other hand, we have the osteoclasts, which are bone-eating cells. They eat up or resorb bone. Resorb here means returning calcium and phosphorus to the blood. Deposition of bone by the osteoblast and resorption of bone or removal of the calcified material or the calcifying material from the bone, which we call resorption, are very important for remodeling. It's just like when you are making a certain shape out of clay or out of whatever thing that is soft, and you need to change the shape. So you remove a part from one side, you add a part on the other side until you get the final shape you want. So remodeling of bone until we reach the final desired shape is done through both deposition and resorption. There are two hormones that sense the level of calcium in the blood and that help decide whether we now need deposition or resorption. So the process of bone remodeling is controlled by two hormones. The first one is calcitonin hormone that is secreted by the thyroid gland and that helps bone deposition. And the other one, the parathormone hormone, which is the antagonistic of calcitonin that helps resorption. But although they do antagonizing functions, yet as usual, like in case of adrenaline and noradrenaline, or the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. They look antagonistic when they are considered separately, but both together help or work in coordination to achieve homeostasis in the body. What are osteocytes? As I said before, when the osteoblasts start laying down calcium around their lacunae, they get imprisoned and they stop doing this and they become converted into mature bone cells. But does this mean that the process of calcification has ended? No, because not all the osteoblasts reach that stage at the same time. So there will always be osteocytes and osteoblasts. When the osteocytes get imprisoned or actually the osteoblasts get imprisoned and become converted into osteocytes, they start doing other functions. As you know, the osteocytes have processes. They have extensions that run into the canaliculi, and those extensions act as mechanosensors, meaning that they can feel, they act like receptors, sensory receptors that detect the pressure or the forces that are applied on the bone. They detect their direction. Where are they coming from? Are they oblique? Are they vertical downwards? Are they compressing? So what is the direction of force to which the bone is exposed? Is this useful? Yes, because sensing the direction of forces will help the osteocyte send signals to the osteoblast and to the osteoclast. What kind of signals? They are chemical signals, chemical molecules sent to the osteoblast to tell them actually where they should deposit bone. Actually, they do not tell the osteoblast actually through language where to detect bone, to deposit bone. But how can they do this? They can do this by sending their signals only to those osteoblasts that are in the trajectory or the journey or the line of applying of the force. So if the force is oblique, then the osteocyte will send the signals to all the osteoblasts that lie in the straight line that is continuous with the line of the force, so that they can lay down more calcium here so that the bone can endure the pressure. And at the same time, they send signals to the osteoclasts, that are located in the places where we do not need to deposit bone. On the contrary, maybe we would need to remove bone. So all the time, there is minimal remodeling that you do not feel, that you do not detect, because it's not reflected on the external shape of the bone, but rather it's an inside process whose aim is to make the bone denser along the lines of force or along the lines that are exposed to the greatest pressures and forces. Osteocytes, as you know, will control the process of ossification, as we have just said, but they also secrete soluble products, chemical molecules. So it's like chemical communication or chemical signaling or a chemical language whose words are chemical molecules. The osteocytes send those chemical molecules even to distant organs like the kidneys to control calcium and phosphorus, because you know that the kidney can control the amount of calcium and phosphorus excreted by the body. How do we call this process of sending signaling molecules to distant areas? We call them endocrine. If the signaling molecule is sent to a nearby cell, we call this paracrine. But if it is sent along blood to a nearby target, to a distant remote target organ, we call this endocrine. So all the time we have a certain kind of balance that like involves the level of calcium and phosphorus in the blood, which we call the calcium balance. We will be focusing only on the calcium balance. So your body can pass through 3 stages. The stage of positive calcium balance, where the body is adding bone, where the osteoblasts are depositing calcium and phosphorus. And in such a case, you will have a positive calcium balance because deposition is more than resorption. Notice that even during positive calcium balance, resorption does not stop. All what happens is that the rate of deposition increases and the rate of resorption decreases so that you can have a net deposition of calcium. When does this happen? During growth. During growth, from day 0 or day 1 of your life until you reach puberty or even after, during growth. But afterward, after the age of 30 to 40, this starts declining, and maybe the process of resorption would be greater than or occurring at a higher rate than deposition. But it also happens in grown-up people and old people if we need to repair an area. And in such a case, we would be in a temporary positive calcium balance because we need to deposit more than we need to resorb. On the other hand, just like it occurs in old females after menopause, when there is a negative calcium balance and the bones are losing calcium more than they are depositing calcium. And again, I say deposition never stops, resorption never stops, but what we are discussing here is the relationship between the two. So if deposition rate is smaller than if deposition, yes, is less than resorption, then resorption is higher and we have a negative calcium balance. At a certain moment or at certain moments of your life, the rates are equal. Deposition is equal to the resorption. So you are in a state of bone equilibrium or zero calcium balance. But notice that, as we always say, this is not static equilibrium, but this is dynamic equilibrium. What do we mean by dynamic equilibrium? Dynamic equilibrium means that the process of deposition is on, the process of resorption is on, but they are equal to each other. But if the bone equilibrium were static, this means that the level of calcium and phosphorus are constant in the bone, no more deposition, no more resorption. But this actually does not happen in the human body. Most types of equilibrium or equilibria inside the human body are dynamic. Sometimes we do x-rays to follow up the case and see whether the bone has healed or not, and we find that the bone does not want to heal, sometimes even after a surgery. So what are the causes of delayed healing? First of all, a poor blood supply, like in old age, for example. Why? Because you know that the source of stem cells that form the fibroblasts, that form the chondroblasts, that form the osteoblasts, the source is the blood. So if there isn't adequate blood supply coming from the periosteal vessels, then healing will be very slow. Similarly, poor nutrition, because why do we want a blood supply via the arteries mainly? To supply oxygen and energy, to supply oxygen and glucose to get energy. So if your blood does not contain enough glucose because of poor nutrition and does not contain enough amino acids, because you do not only need glucose for energy, but you need amino acids to build up the protein matrix, the collagen fibers and the elastin fibers. Number 3, failure of complete immobilization of the bony parts. Usually, if you want the bones to heal, then you have to do something very important. You have to get those bony ends on one straight line, and this is what we call reduction of the fracture. So sometimes the medical doctors in emergency units do this without anesthesia. So they just pull onto the leg from both sides to make the two bony ends distant enough from each other to avoid this overlap. Because if you leave the bones overlapped like this, they will heal, but the process of healing will be very slow and very irregular. So after having done this process of reduction and made the bones on one straight line, you have to put a cast around the leg in order to fix it in place. And in case of compound fractures, usually the cast is not enough, and you need to do a surgery or to have a surgery done in order to make the two bony ends far enough from each other until you can get them on one straight line, and then fix the two bony ends with a plate and screws that are, of course, made of titanium in order to be not reactive inside the body. Otherwise, they would cause problems inside the body. But if you fail to do this for any reason, then the process of healing will be very, very slow. Sometimes patients do not want cast and you just put a bandage. This does not ensure proper immobilization. Sometimes in a compound injury, the parts of the bones around the fracture are usually crushed. So they are dispersed fragments, and when you remove those dispersed fragments that are useless and that would hinder healing, you will find out that at the end of the day, the fractured ends are very far from each other, and therefore it would be very difficult to make them heal unless you put a bony graft. You take a bone from a part of a bone from a long bone like the femur, and then you insert it between the bony ends. One of the major causes of delayed healing, and that shouldn't occur in hospitals, is infection. If for a reason or another you immobilize the bone by a cast, but this was in an area where there are no hospitals, there are no disinfectants, of course infection can occur. Or if it's in a hospital, very small hospital, in a rural area where there aren't enough supplies and there aren't enough facilities for sterilization, then infection would occur. Infection will destroy this callus that is necessary for the two bones to join together. So infection is one of the major causes of delayed healing. I'll stop here. Thank you for watching. I hope you found that video useful and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, please write them down. They are very useful to me. The feedback is very useful. And I would be honored if you like the video and write a comment and subscribe to my channel so that we can make those pieces of information, if you found them useful, reach the largest number possible of students and people who are interested. Thank you and see you on the next video.